Welcome to the Rethink Leadership podcast with me, Jeremy Blaine. I interview leaders, experts and business professionals from around the world who are bringing leadership principles and know-how into the digitally driven 21st century workplace, with focus firmly on the how-to rather than the what. Each episode is in aid of a charity chosen by my guests, and since 2020, we've made donations to over 80 global and local causes. My guest for today's Rethink Leadership podcast is Yankel Meislin. He's a life and business coach, helping people extract themselves from often self-created boxes, journeys and ways of life, in business and in our communities. Perhaps the remarkable thing is that Yankel is doing this at all. When you hear his story about his life on the streets of New York and his own gang and drug empire, he came very close to getting sucked in for good and worse, losing his life. We uncover Yankel's journey from a young teenager dragged into a life he embraced fully and then out of the other side into where he finds himself now, in business and communities and through his rediscovered Hasidic faith. This episode is in aid of the Friendship Circle of Brooklyn. Yankel chose this organisation because children with special needs teach us how to treat ourselves and others. They don't have the judgments and masks that we carry around often as adults and exemplify what living your true self is all about in an automatic, pure and innocent way. Yankel, thanks so much for joining me today. Before we talk about your personal journey, please introduce yourself, tell us about your passions and your coaching business.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeremy. It's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Yankel Meislin. I am a life and business coach, and I am most passionate about helping people to get out of the self-created box or boxes that they find themselves in. I find that most of the time people get into those boxes, usually carries over from their business to their personal life or from their personal life to their business. And I have a strong passion of reading between the lines to figure out where those boxes are, what are the limitations of those boxes, and then ultimately to help people to break through the walls of those boxes in order to, see the fresh air on the other side of the box.
I like that, those self-created boxes, understanding both the limitations and the breakthrough potential for people to reach those potentials. But it wasn't always that way for you, Yankel. And I know many of those tuning in will be surprised by your story if I take you back to when you were 14 years old and went on quite a different path, leading to being a drug dealer and drinker with a personal bodyguard. I'll leave it there. And if you wouldn't mind telling us more, and probably importantly, the reactions of those people who loved you and how they tried to help at the time before we get to how you got out of that.
Okay, here we go. There's a lot to unpack there. So first of all, I will start by saying that I did not grow up in the religious community. I grew up as a secular Jew, which means that I more or less look like everybody else, When I was younger, I really liked hip hop and I dressed in that kind of fashion. Biggie Smalls was my hero and Wu-Tang Clan and all that kind of stuff. Those were my things at the time. Unfortunately for me, I was a small kind of kid. I had a growth deficiency, hormone lack, I guess is, I think, what they called it. I forgot exactly what it's called. And so I was on the small statured side in my class, probably the smallest kid. But I did have a really big knack for using my intellect and my words to put people in their place. And when I did that, they had a tendency to use their strengths, which was their physical strength, to put me in my place, which I found to be very emasculating, humiliating, and just overall very depressing. So due to that, I had a certain propensity towards depression. And at the age of 14, along with a lot of my friends at that time in high school, probably 90% of the high school in my grade, started to find out, the wonders and magic of alcohol and drugs. And when I found that, I realized that if I was high or drunk, the disproportionate responses that I would get was basically didn't bother me in the least. So it became for me a way to escape from the depression that I essentially that I created for myself because of my own wittiness, I guess you could call it. But it really helped me to be able to get out of myself. Now, here's the interesting part. My father is himself a drug therapist and a therapist in general. And so he started to notice the signs kind of early on, missing class a lot, my grades were not up to par according to where, my intellect level they should have been. And so they tried lots and lots of different ways in order to prevent the avalanche from crashing down. They wanted to keep the snow on the top of the mountain for as long as they possibly could. So I went to therapies, I went to different drug rehabilitation centers. Ultimately, none of that really took hold on me so long as I had in my mind that this is who I am and this is what I want to do. And that's kind of where it left off at the age of 18, after I had spent 24 months in a rehab center that should have been 6 months long.
Wow. And you said there was a lot to unpack there. So from Biggie Smalls and rap through to the words versus muscles, and how this got into this sort of almost depressive state, that the only way through it that you found was through drink and drugs, and moving that way. I found it fascinating actually that your father was a drug rehabilitation therapist as well. I mean, that must have been devastating for him in some ways. In many ways. A, being his father, and then being sort of almost in that business. And it also strikes me the power of the mind when you make a decision, say, this is my life. Where did that kind of drug life ultimately lead you to before you did something about it?
Not great paths. Unfortunately for me, I would say, looking back on it now, I am a pretty successful businessman, and I was able to grow my empire exponentially as a young man. So between the age of about 15 to 16, I was on my own. I did my own thing, and that's I had to sell drugs in order to support my habit, but it was on a much lower scale. Then when I was 16 and I went into this rehab program, I kind of graduated to the big leagues a little bit more. I learned a lot more through my contact with other like-minded people. And eventually, when I reached the other side, I became 18 and my own legal guardian at that point. Nobody could really tell me what to do so long as I wasn't arrested by the police. So I hired my own gang-affiliated bodyguard, started a much more lucrative business, and made about $200,000 at age 19 selling cocaine, heroin, and weed.
That is astonishing, and the magnetism of that to a young man is very powerful when you can see success, when you're being protected, when your ego is being kind of lifted up. But you ultimately saw the light and you changed your path. So, can you identify the moment or the situation where you had an epiphany or things changed and you made a decision to do something different? And what happened then?
So there were two kind of key moments for me that happened. One was in our I had about 10 or so people who worked for me in various capacities. And one of them was a guy who was a Mafia hitman. He was very good friends with my bodyguard growing up. And he was kind of like our enforcer of some kind, to intimidate other people to not encroach on our business. So he found out that my bodyguard was using heroin, which was a big problem in the Mafia. Heroin is a big issue because it's longer jail sentences if you get caught. There's a higher chance of becoming I don't know what the appropriate PC term is, but a turncoat essentially, and turning on your friends. And so the Mafia hitman called my mother and warned her that I was in a dangerous situation because he knew that I was the top of the house of cards, and if you remove this card, then the entire house would fall, because I was the one who was sober and not using those, sober meaning I just used weed, and I was the one who was propping up the business with my acumen and my money, essentially. So that was number one. My parents offered me an ultimatum. They said, you can either leave that life or you can leave our home. And I thought about it for about a day. I ran through every possible scenario I could in which I would come out on the other side with my business intact. And every single simulation ended with either me in jail, dead, or in a mental institution. So I decided to take them up on their offer. And they sent me to a rehab facility far enough away that, you can't just leave that life. So the people who I left behind would have been very bitter about the fact that I was leaving and possibly wished to harm me. In fact, I know that they were surveilling my house from the moment that I left until, I'm not even sure for how long exactly. So when I went to Florida to rehab, which was far enough away that I was kind of out of their grips, because they would have to take a flight down there, and that's already a little bit of a more complicated operation. I went to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting where the woman in the meeting was telling the story of the binding of Isaac from the Bible, which, just a quick rehash of that story, is God gives Abraham a son at 99 years old. His name is Isaac. Then he tells Abraham, I want you to take Isaac and sacrifice him, even though I promised that through Isaac would become a nation. And Abraham does it without question. So as she's telling the story, I'm kind of noticing that there's some parallels to my own story. Except that in my scenario, I kind of forced my father to bring me up to the mountain and forced him to put the knife to my throat. And only by a miracle, that a Mafia hitman saved my life, was I able to not, have that not be sacrificed. And that was really the moment of clarity for me, where everything just switched. I realized that the whole path that I had been on was a farce. It wasn't really who I was. And the proof was that I'm here now in rehab and willing to accept the fact that I have to start over my life from zero and recreate who it is that I am, and really find out who exactly that is first.
Wow, that's quite something. Also, at that age, to have that kind of enlightenment and maturity in some ways, being that you'd been very successful with what you're doing. So you've talked about getting in there. You've talked about these moments that had helped you. So what did you learn? And when you'd really kind of bought into that rehab in Florida, and how did that shape your path as a more religious person at Temple, in the community, and of course from a business perspective, which you'd already proved that you were good at?
Yeah, so the main thing that I think that I learned was that I'm not actually a ruthless, cold-hearted drug dealer, and that whole persona that I put on for my own ego was really totally fake, 100% fake. That wasn't who I really was. It wasn't my values. Nothing about it was really real. And so what I started to discover was that who I actually am is I am a person who likes to learn. I am a person who likes to be empathetic and help others. I am a person who has compassion and cares for other people. And so when I started to get in touch with my true um, self, I guess you could call it, my true, who I really am, then it started to line up with different aspects of my life. So, for example, in the rehab, I was offered the opportunity to meet a rabbi because I had expressed some interest in Judaism because of that story that the woman told. And when I came into contact with him, I realized that that world was a lot more in line with who I was than the world that I was pretending to live in. And to be totally honest, and I don't mean this in any real negative light per se, but the the general world, let's say there are, let's call it three worlds that I have danced in somewhat. There is the regular world that you see, you go to work, you go home, you put on your TV, you go to sleep, you wake up and you do it again. Then there was the underworld, which is the world of the darkness and the seediness that exists underneath the surface of the regular world. And sometimes the people from the regular world kind of go over into the underworld. And then the third world that I have danced in is the religious world. So in the regular, quote unquote, regular world, I found that a lot of the values are not really in line with who I am. Like machoism, for example, as a great quality is something that is valued in the quote unquote regular world, but it's not valued. It's not really who I align with. So once I found a world in which my true self aligns much more closely to, I started to delve into that and really embrace that kind of lifestyle, which ultimately led me to becoming myself a Hasidic Jew. In business, in a business sense, a lot of the lessons on a broad sense that I took from my time as a drug dealer are definitely applicable, but now I can apply them in a more honest way and not in a conniving and like I want to get over on you type of way, which also is much more aligned with who I really am versus who I was pretending to be at that time.
Yeah, I understand, and I do like how you describe the normal or regular world, the underworld, and the more spiritual or religious world. That resonates actually, because I suppose even as human beings, many human beings have an underworld or one that's hidden, the dark there, and whether people are religious or not, they can appreciate some level of spirituality, whether that's in nature or religion or whatever it is. And I'm now putting myself in place of those who are tuning into this podcast and who've still got their mouths open, having having listened to what you've been saying there. And I'm wondering if you can, because the research that I'm doing is telling us that leaders and many people in business, we're having more and more difficulties. We're hearing more about anxieties, mental health issues, um, stressors. It is leading to addiction in some places. I've had a guest on recently who very bravely has told her story as a business leader in that way, as bravely as you. And I'm wondering if you could share with those tuning in the lessons, the key lessons I think that they can learn from your journey that help them navigate their life, their business, and potentially their spirituality.
I love that question. Um, Here's what I will say. One of the biggest lessons that I've learned so far, and I see this lacking in a lot of people, and it was certainly lacking in me for a very long time, is we tend to approach ourselves and the world with a stick of discipline. like the ruler that the teacher is going to come and start smacking you on the wrist, or wherever else they might smack you on with. That is the way in which we tend to approach ourselves, and the way that we tend to judge the situations and the people around us. And what I found is that when I am attempting to beat myself up with a stick, or supremely judging the situations and the people around me, I go into a place of a bit negativity. And when I'm in a place of negativity, my mind stops functioning the way that it should function, because I'm so bogged down by the judgments and the discipline in which I imagine needs to be meted out in order for me to, quote unquote, succeed or grow or whatever, right? Like, so let's say I made a mistake yesterday, let's just say, and instead of treating myself with the compassion that I deserve, I'm coming at myself with a stick. What exactly am I gaining from that situation by approaching myself in that way? What am I gaining from looking back on my life and saying, you are such a loser who was a drug dealer back in the day, and you've hurt many people and whatever, and putting myself down? What am I actually gaining from approaching myself in that way, as opposed to an approach with empathy and compassion, which will lead me to a more positive approach in the future, a more positive approach when it comes to the people who I surround myself with. Let's say if you're a leader or a boss, your subordinates, it's so much more useful and helpful for other people to grow, and for yourself to approach with positivity, as opposed to the brutal beatdowns that we tend to inflict on ourselves. And the proof is simply in the pudding. Imagine if you were trying to deal with a child in the way in which we deal with ourselves, you would absolutely destroy the child before he has even a chance to build himself up into anything. But somehow, some way, we've convinced ourselves that that is actually the appropriate response and how we should, in fact, deal with ourselves. I find that to be 100% total self-destruction to the utmost, providing no value whatsoever. And in fact, if we treated ourselves more like the way that we treat our children, we would be better people, the world would be a better place, and a lot more things would get done.
Really beautifully put. Those approaching situations with positivity, and almost it's reducing that self-talk, that negative self-talk. And you're so right. If you did that with others, the way that you do it, that we can be guilty of doing it to ourselves, we'd probably be horrified with ourselves, as everybody else would be, no doubt, as well. So point well made. And I'm sure many listening in will want to find out more, connect with you, and keep the discussion going. How do they do that, Yankel?
You can find me most easily on my website, www.igniteyourflamecoaching.com.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Yankel Meislin. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks for tuning in to the Rethink Leadership podcast with me, Jeremy Blaine. Please like, comment, and support us on your favourite platform, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can watch as well as listen to each episode.